just elected Woodrow Wilson president. So now we're going to take a closer look at Wilson himself. We focused quite a bit on particularly his opponent Teddy Roosevelt before. Woodrow Wilson was from Virginia. He was the first person elected president who had a PhD. In his case, a PhD in history and political science from Johns Hopkins University. In fact, he had such an academic background. He wasn't just a professor. He had previously been the president of Princeton University in New Jersey. And later, from there, from the state of New Jersey, his adopted state, he successfully ran for governor. So at the time he was running for president, he was halfway through his gubernatorial term in New Jersey. Well, one thing that you can say about Woodrow Wilson is that he was definitely a product of his time and his native region and his upbringing. Woodrow Wilson was it's fair to say, a racist person. Teddy Roosevelt, his predecessor, had invited Booker T. Washington to the White House. Woodrow Wilson, on the other hand, screened the movie Birth of a Nation, which we'll talk about later, that has as its heroes the Ku Klux Klan in the White House. And bear in mind that at this time, Washington, D.C. was a segregated city. Another thing to bear in mind about Woodrow Wilson is he was extremely religious, very serious about his religiosity. I suppose it would be fair to say that many people would have perceived him as being somewhat parsimonious. That is going to play a part in his political approaches and the things that he does as president. Now, when we discussed the 1912 election, we talked about how really everyone involved, all four candidates, were progressive to one extent or another. Woodrow Wilson was maybe closer to the center than the others. However, as you can see, during his first term, quite a few progressive achievements were made during his administration. 1914 saw the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act. Roosevelt had really been wielding his power as president to enforce rules against trusts or monopolies. Wilson was going to continue that, although not to the same extent that Roosevelt had. But he clearly, in this law that was passed by Congress, it clearly states that unions are exempt from those laws. Some people try to say, well, what is a union but a monopoly? Which would have then given the federal government a cudgel with which to break unions the same way that monopolies were being broken. Wilson was against that. He also, this law barred injunctions. That's something that we've mentioned before. That's where a federal judge can issue something called an injunction when there's a strike that says that that strike is illegal. Therefore, picketing is not allowed and everyone has to go back to work. These injunctions would be the excuse, the reason given for state and federal governments to send troops in to break up strikes. In previous progressive administrations, there had been a move to try to limit injunctions, but this law barred them completely. That is going to be a temporary thing. That's something that will change. But at least for this point, judges cannot issue injunctions. The 1916 Keating-Owen Act, finally a congressional act banning child labor. Now, Congress did not have the right to ban child labor outright. That's something that state legislatures, individually in their state, had the authority to do. But what this law did, Congress banned child labor for any goods that are manufactured and then sent across state lines. And of course, that's going to be a large number of goods. So even though they can't tell states you have to have these child labor laws, the fact that the federal government puts them in place leaves the states very little choice. That is a tactic that the federal government has used down through the years in various other things. 1916, this is pretty significant, the Adamson Act finally established an 8-hour workday for railroad workers who were among the workers who had been agitating for this the strongest for a very long time. Again, initially just applying to railroad workers, but pretty quickly expanding to include other workers as well. So this was the basis on which we have the 40-hour work week. It had taken, how long? It had taken 3 or 4 decades to get this accomplished. 1916, the Warehouse Act, legislation that fulfilled the agenda, another agenda of the populist movement and of the Populist Party back in the 1890s. People have been trying to get this for a long time. The Warehouse Act extends credit to farmers who store their grain in federally licensed warehouses. One of the big concerns for farmers had been for a very long time that storing their grain, they were being charged exorbitant rates by the railroads. If this is something that's being done by the federal government can give them credit, right, and make it easier in the long run for them to be able to store their grain. So there you have several different accomplishments. Here are some others. 1913, the Federal Reserve System was created. This is something that had already been set in place before Wilson came into office because, it really went back to 1907. There had been a panic, which is almost a depression, but not quite. The Panic of 1907, which resulted in banks around the country being in danger of collapsing. Now, if the banks collapse, one after the other, it's a domino effect. The economy is going to collapse as well. In 1907, none other than J.P. Morgan, the ultra-rich multi-millionaire financier, stepped in with his own money and propped up the banks. He bailed out the banks and prevented the panic from becoming a depression. On the one hand, that's, sounds like a good idea, a good thing there was someone there who could do that. The government wasn't in a position to do it. But on the other hand, it made a lot of people think, wow, that's kind of dangerous, isn't it? To think of one person having so much power that they could bail out the entire American banking system. It worked out well this time, but in the future, there was the possibility it might not work out so well for someone to have that kind of financial power. Therefore, the Federal Reserve System was set up, a central banking system to regulate interest rates of banks. 1914, the Federal Trade Commission set up to regulate businesses in various